Rupert, and thank you all for coming here today. I am delighted to welcome you to this building, which, as all of you know, was formerly Conservative Central Office. It was from the windows of this very building that Margaret Thatcher and Norman Tebbit acknowledged the adulation of the cheering crowds in 3 successive general elections back in the glory days of the Conservative Party. And it is a tragedy, an ironic tragedy, to think that this building, which has so much Conservative history in it, should now be the headquarters of the occupying power in our country. Now, it's customary at these events to start with thanks to a lot of people. And I do so with great sincerity because I've received over my career and also indeed over the development of this book an enormous amount of help. For which I'm very grateful. And of course I must start with Rupert. Rupert has done all the boring stuff. Rupert has done the editing. Rupert has made the format Kindle compatible. You see, we're really up to speed with latest technology. If you prefer to read it on your Kindle, you can do so. So thank you very much indeed for that. A point that Rupert didn't make, but I think is worth making, is that Rupert, of course, stood in the European election in 2009. He was the number 3 candidate, in other words, the first one who didn't quite make it, after the 2 who were elected in the East Midlands. What that means, of course, is that if I were to fall under a bus or to have a heart attack, then, of course, Rupert, without further ado, would pop up the list and into my seat. So I'm thinking of taking out a little bit of extra life assurance. Now, I should of course also thank my staff who've done a very great deal of work in putting today and indeed the book together. Neelam, my press officer, Joe Bono, there's Joe, good, a New Yorker of Italian extraction, that worries me sometimes, but he does a fantastic job, and of course Lydia Smith, who will be known to many of you, she is there at the back, good. I should particularly mention Joe. I feel really embarrassed because the photograph on the front cover of my book was actually taken by Joe. And I regret to say, Joe, I forgot to put the photo credit in, so I'm afraid you'll have to make do without that. I'd like to thank Simon Richards and the Freedom Association, because as many of you will know, for some years I was the chairman of the Freedom Association, and I was enormously supported by the association staff. Christiana's there somewhere. Thank you all for what you have done and contributed to my career such as it has been. I should of course say thank you to, although they're not here, to Lord Lawson and John Redwood, both of whom have provided some words of wisdom for the cover of the book. Lord Lawson was kind enough to say it was well-informed and merciless, which I thought was quite a nice line. John Redwood said Roger Helmer revels in controversy. Well, I'm sure there's nobody here who will for a moment agree with that. And I should also like to thank Chris Heaton-Harris, who was here and will be back, but has a meeting across the other side that he has to deal with. Chris, of course, was my colleague from the East Midlands for 10 years, from 1999 to 2009. He's now in the Westminster Parliament. And his comradeship and friendship and help and support have been enormously valuable to me. He didn't have any direct contribution to the book, but he had a considerable contribution to the career that led up to the book. Now, when I was looking for a theme for the book, it seemed to me that skepticism was the obvious linking theme. And I asked myself, how did I get to be of a skeptical turn of mind? And I will turn here to a subject I almost never speak of, which is my early youth. Because I was born into a family which is at the nonconformist end of the Protestant spectrum and takes a very literal view of the Bible and a very harsh view on social issues. Of course, as a child, I accepted that without question, because you do. You just agree with what your parents tell you. In my early teens, I started questioning it and saying, well, how do they know what they're telling me? Well, they read it in the Bible. How do we know that the Bible is right? And this launched me on a period when I was heavily engaged, first in the family and then with the elders of the church and eventually at university, in debating that particular issue. I say I don't mention it very often, and one of the reasons I don't mention it very often is because Bill Newton Dunn, of unhappy memory, learned that I was brought up in such a family, And every so often he sends emails around the European Parliament saying, Helmer's extremely strange views on the European Union are nothing to do with politics. It's all to do with the fact that he is a religious mole in the Parliament and that he believes that the European Union is based on the Book of Revelation and is the Antichrist and like that. This will come as a surprise to people who know me. I was recently described as a high church atheist, which is a description I would not disagree with too strongly. Certainly I agree with Prince Charles in his position on the Book of Common Prayer and the King James Version, even if I can't always agree with him on other subjects. But I found myself thinking today, or earlier this week, what is the opposite of skepticism? It's one of those words that doesn't seem to have a convenient opposite. Perhaps gullibility, although that seems unkind. Perhaps true believer status, and we get plenty of true believers in Brussels. I think the nearest I can find to an opposite of skepticism is consensus. And certainly in Brussels you will find consensus. And most of the people in Brussels agree that whatever the problem, the solution is more Europe. Europe is in trouble, we need more Europe. The euro is crashing, we need more Europe. We need more centralisation, we need more bureaucracy. That will be the solution. That is the consensus in Brussels. Strangely enough, when I talk to London taxi drivers or chat to folk in the pub, I don't find many people in the UK who accept that particular consensus. But bear in mind, most of the people who take this view in Brussels are on the payroll. They have a towering contempt for the ordinary voter. You can see that in their response to referenda, again and again and again. They simply dismiss the response to a referendum, occasionally wringing their hands and saying, perhaps we haven't explained it quite well enough. Now, I spent most of the last 12 years explaining Europe to people, and my experience is the more I explain it, the angrier they get. So often, consensus is mistaken. There was once a consensus that the earth was flat, and that didn't last very long. I recommend Christopher Booker's book, Scared to Death, in which he goes through a whole series of media scares which later turned out to have no substance. We all remember, of course, Edwina Curry and salmonella in eggs. That scare was devastating to the British poultry industry, but there was no salmonella in eggs. We remember CJD. It was a very serious disease, but I believe that only 150 or so people ever died of it. At the time when it was discovered, we were told that at least 500,000 would die and perhaps more. So the scare was entirely unjustified. Similar comments apply to bird flu. And particularly, there is the case of the millennium bug. Now, I can remember Tony Blair standing up in 1998 and saying the biggest threat to British industry is the millennium bug. Well, the millennium bug came and went, and it's now 11 years ago, and as we all know, nothing happened at all. So, I challenge the Brussels consensus on the benefits of Europe, and I agree with my colleague Daniel Hannan, who has said that the EU is making us poorer and less democratic and less free. I won't expand on that because you've all heard my views on the subject, and anyway, it's all in the book. But I do devote a whole chapter of the book to the euro. Now, the situation of the euro, again, is well known to you, and I won't go into it in any detail. But it is a slow motion rail crash, and I'm not sure it's even that slow motion at the moment. Now, I and many others like me were saying that the whole theory of a single currency area for Europe simply didn't make any sense. It would lead to trouble. We talked about asymmetric shocks and so on. I have to say, in the early part of the last decade, 2002, 2003, 2004, people were saying to me, well, you promised us disaster. You said it would fall apart. The euro's doing very well. It's becoming a second global reserve currency. Its value has been maintained. You were wrong, weren't you? And my only answer to that was, well, you better wait and see, which is not a very strong response on the day. But of course we did wait, and we did see, and now we have seen it happen. Schadenfreude is an ugly thing, but I think we're entitled to a little of it sometimes. We told you what would happen to the euro, and now it is happening. The other issue of consensus, of course, which has engaged me for the last 4 or 5 years or so, is the whole question of climate change. We are told that the IPCC represents a consensus of scientific opinion on climate change. The IPCC is not a consensus. I have met and worked with so many IPCC reviewers and panelists who have told me that in some cases they've resigned, in one case they had to threaten legal action to get their name off one of the IPCC reports. They tell me that their comments and their criticisms are simply ignored and brushed aside. Particularly I remember Professor Fred Singer, who's one of the most distinguished American professors in this field, University of Virginia. He said, the IPCC accepts my corrections of its punctuation, but they dismiss my corrections of its science. The whole IPCC process is, of course, controlled by a relatively small, about 2.5 dozen, and incestuous group of scientists, some of whom you will find at the University of East Anglia Climate Research Unit. They publish each other's papers, they review each other's papers, they try very hard to intimidate authors of learned journals to prevent dissenting views from being published, and so on. And they control, of course, the content of the IPCC reports. But of course, the climate change debate is not merely about science, it's also doing huge political and economic damage. I was delighted over the weekend, as recently as that, to see Charles Moore's piece in the Telegraph, Lord Lawson's piece in the Mail, editorials in both papers, Lord Turnbull, very senior former civil servant, writing an excellent report condemning climate hysteria. And of course the CBI at last has acquired some backbone and has told the government that if it goes on like this, industries will simply not invest in Britain, they will go elsewhere. And this is of course the classic lose-lose situation. Britain loses the production, the jobs and the investment, but actually the industrial processes go to countries outside the UK, outside the EU, mostly with lower environmental standards. And therefore you probably get more emissions, more pollution, and a worse outcome for the environment at the same time as you are actually damaging the British economy. I love the quote from Charles Moore. He said in his Telegraph article, he said, recently I was flying across the English Channel and I saw an offshore wind farm. He said, with its vertical columns and crosses, it looked like a military cemetery. Tony Blair and his successors are burying the British economy at sea. So much for scepticism, and it's all there in the book, and I hope and pray you'll read it. But is it then all negative? Is scepticism about believing nothing and denying everything? Not at all. Some people say to me, what is the alternative to the EU? If we left the EU, what should we do? Well, we'd be an independent democratic nation. That would be a good start, wouldn't it? It's a bit like looking at a man standing on Beachy Head and about to jump, and you say, don't jump. And he says, what is the alternative? Well, the alternative is pretty obvious. The alternative is not to jump. In the same way, the alternative to being a member of the EU is not being a member of the EU. And there are plenty of countries much smaller than Britain that are perfectly capable of surviving and thriving, Norway, Switzerland, Singapore, outside the EU and with their own currencies. The alternative to EU membership, ladies and gentlemen, is freedom and independence and democracy. And as I say, I think in the concluding words of my book, I was born a free man, well actually a baby, but you know what I mean. I was born a free man in a free country, and all I ask is to be a free man in a free country again. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Roger. I think Roger will take questions if there are any. Otherwise, I will just remind everyone that the copies of the book Sceptic at Large are here at the front, and for you lucky people who have come along today, they are free. So please come along and take your copy.